about, you've played an active role in Jasolin, but also you've been with organizations, international organizations, at the heart of what we call knowledge brokering. This being knowledge brokering, being the rapid and the acceleration of the of science of learning to the practitioner and the policymaker for implementation, particularly in the context that is important to them, and at the same time, the rapid feedback to the researcher. But I would be interested, what is your definition of knowledge brokering, or what other term would you use?
That's the definition you just mentioned is consistent with mine. Another term that I've come across and that we use probably interchangeably is knowledge translation. I've also come across knowledge transfer, but the idea is basically to learn from the scientific literature and see how those findings can be useful for policy and practice, but also learning from policy and practice as well to see what further issues or gaps need to be explored.
Whom would you observe is doing this? What organizations or people do you think are worth looking at and are doing it well?
Well, let me start with the global level. I think many organizations, if not all organizations, are trying to do this in some way. So, for example, even those of us sitting in a policy organization like UNESCO or the OECD, we are often going through the scientific literature to pull up new findings from other researchers or from other policy organizations, sometimes reports from national governments, and review those and learn from those before developing something new, some new policy recommendations, or in informing a new project at country level. So I think at some level we are all trying to do not necessarily brokering, but we are all trying to learn from the scientific literature. I think when it comes to making it more systematic and turning it into something that is just part of the research to policy and practice process, and then from the policy practice process back to research, that's where it tends to fall apart, and where it's not as systematic. In terms of who is doing this well, just off the top of my head right now, not in any comparative way, I can say that the Education Endowment Fund in the UK is an interesting organization, because that is essentially what they do. They use a lot of the information that is generated from science, but also practitioners and policymakers, to develop recommendations or guiding tools for schools in the UK. So they're more of a national research. I wouldn't even say it's research brokering, because they take the information and they themselves translate it or transform it for school leaders, principals, in other words, and teachers. And I think they're doing it well, because of the fact that they have the staff in there who can understand the research, but at the same time know how to transform it in a way that it can be useful for the practitioners. But it's not a global, I mean, their information obviously is relevant globally, but they're not a global organization.
And that's very helpful. But you mentioned translation, and of course, one of the key areas that we're all pushing for, I believe, is moving as well from translation to actual implementation, and so that taking it to that even next step, which is how do we implement in a way that is adapted to the context of each country, region, and culture. you so we've talked about who's doing it well, or in, but what barriers are there to knowledge brokering, to this process?
The barriers are those that I can talk about, those that I've experienced, which I think are probably going to be the same as barriers for others. I'm not sure if it's because the field is still in its infancy when it comes to education. If you look at the medical field, I think probably the knowledge brokering or translation has been in place, and the systems are there in place for much longer. You can just think about the COVID example, what happened recently, in the sense that um, researchers and policymakers had to work together, and the systems, I guess, were already there to facilitate that, although it's a global level, but eventually it had to come down to the national level, because what the researchers learned from the science and from their experiments had to translate into policy measures, um, to be that where that is how the learning got implemented in the country. And I don't know if that's because in the medical field, it's been around for a long time, where the knowledge from the sciences has made its way into the policy and the practice, and maybe in education we're a bit further behind. But probably it also has to do with the fact that maybe in education, um, the training of the people who sit in these different circles is different, so it's another struggle. So the education researchers are trained, are formed as researchers. They may or may not have practice experience. The practitioners are not trained as researchers, nor are the policymakers. So we come from different backgrounds, and that could be a hurdle, an obstacle. And the fact that, like I said, it's just not systematized, that just it seems that we're always starting from scratch in trying to get something. I like with the Global Science of Learning education network, it seems that, we have to start from the very beginning. We can't seem to pick up from what's already been learned. So these are things that come to mind very quickly about what some of the barriers could be.
So what suggestions do you have for expanding and improving knowledge brokering for the science of learning?
This is a very difficult question. I think maybe an organization, a big organization such as yours, the one I'm working for, need to really make an effort to take it seriously. And as you mentioned, we're all doing this on our voluntary time, and that already is a big hurdle. It does really need to be something that, like the education endowment fund, is done by a full-time staff of people who can dedicate their time to it. And so financing it seriously, to establish a network and set up the systems and processes could could um, could support um, this. And then, of course, yeah, there's a field called implementation science, which we could learn a bit from. I think the idea of implementation science is to learn from projects that are implemented, pilot projects that are implemented, and see how they work and then improve on them. And that is a way of implementing some of the learnings that we have from the science of education, and seeing what they look like, at least in practice, and learning from them before full implementation.
So is there, you mentioned the field of implementation science. Is there a particular resource or organization you'd point to there?
Not necessarily. I know that the development agencies, a lot of the, like, UNICEF, World Bank, UNESCO to some extent, use it in their learnings. Use this to collect data from projects that they have on the ground, learn from them before they scale up. But it's a field that could be helpful in better understanding or learning from to see how we can implement some projects and learn from them.
You mentioned GISOL and Global Science of Learning Education Network earlier. So currently, we're about global network of about 700, largely researchers and some education leaders across the world. The representing maybe over 60 nations. As you point out, everybody's a volunteer pretty much. But how can GISOLN play a useful role?
I think finding a way to see what the issues are, or what are the current struggles in education. Or one of the challenges in a global network is that challenges in education are very context dependent. So, for example, in developing countries where UNESCO works mainly, one of our biggest problems is that children are not learning or behind in learning. So the latest estimates show that about 70% of these kids cannot read or write a simple sentence by age 10, which is a big deal for the children, for education, but it's not the same challenge that we would have in other countries. So having a global challenge that we can all work on might be difficult because each education gap is context dependent. Having said that, the challenge that we have in developing countries, I think, is something that we can learn from what the science says. What are we doing poorly about how we're designing the curriculum, how the instructional material, given the context that the children are in. Maybe there's no electricity, maybe they're coming to school hungry. So there's a lot that we can learn in developing better pedagogy and curriculum to support those kids to improve their learning. So that's one example, but it doesn't mean it could be this, it's the same challenge globally. So it would have to be something that would need to be decided on a more local context.
Yes, and I guess one thought I have is going back to what could be a useful role for GISOLN. Some have suggested that there are many who are already doing this work in different ways, and perhaps the best thing is to not try to train a whole group of people, but to look at what is being done effectively and then seek to empower and put together information that others could use to improve what they're doing. Any thoughts on good ways to proceed?
Yeah, I think there's a very big need for what the Global Science of Learning Education Network is trying to do. And it's valuable. And I think the struggle is that we're trying to figure out how to do this. I think, like I said, given that it's probably still in its infancy, in particular in the field of education. And maybe one interesting way to start, as you were just bringing this up, is to take a look at what the other organizations are doing, what their reach is, how successful are they, and how do they decide what scientific findings should or should not get translated, and then how do they turn into either programs for children or policy recommendations. Sort of looking at other models that are successful and see what they're doing, and then seeing what would be the value added that GSOLN can contribute. And the network, for me, the fact that it's a global network is already a big piece of this, because although we have different challenges across the world, one of the advantages is to learn from each other. And so this is an interest for not just the researchers, but also the practitioners. And I think it's something that the more localized or national organizations can't do, because they're local. So having a global network for me is the value added that this network could bring. And it being global, like I said, now with our modern technology, bringing people together across the world might not be so difficult or challenging or costly as it once was. So a global network with a platform where everyone can come together, I think could be useful.
Thank you. This is very helpful, and we're looking at moving from starting with low tech and moving eventually to higher tech in the sense of, as you say, a platform that people can access. So I will thank you very, very much.
Well, I'm happy to help, and
Uh,
I will send you the